Fists and Fiends is a martial arts focused tabletop RPG written by Randy Brown of Get Hooked Games. So, as the story goes, Randy, a co-owner and head coach at Randy Brown Mantis Boxing and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu over in Massachusetts, was happily running his dojo until the pandemic hit in 2020, at which time he needed to engage with his young martial arts students remotely. He ended up developing this martial arts RPG as a result, and it got polished up to the point that even the parents of the students started getting interested in playing. 5 years later, it has culminated into a crowdfund campaign. The setting for this game is rather specific because the martial arts styles you're working with are also relatively specific. It's 1800s northern China in the wake of one of the worst floods in human history. In this setting, you start off as a person who has been holed up in a hilltop fortress for 3 years, having learned martial arts from one of several grand masters. And now it is time to set out on one kind of journey or another. Out there are pirates, rebels, bandits, brigands, and warlords, and all you have are your fists and feet, and eventually weapons, and also elemental magic if you choose that class. So let's get right down to the most important part for a lot of you watching. How do the dice work? If you're familiar with the Year Zero engine, the mechanics of this game might be quite familiar to you. Your character is primarily composed of 4 stats: might, sleight, wit, and grit. These are rated from 2 to 5. Under each of these core attributes are skills, and there are 18 in total. They are rated from 0 to 5. And then you have a so-called fight die, which starts as a D6, but eventually levels up to a D8, and finally a D12. Anytime you're attempting an important action or attacking or defending, you or the GM will determine which skill you're using, and you'll roll that many dice, plus the rating from the underlying attribute of that skill. If it's an attack or you're using weapons or special gear, you'll also roll that fight die. Any rolled 6s are considered successes. In the case of a fight die that is a D8 or D12, 6 or above is a success, and a 10, 11, or 12 on a D12 counts as 2 successes. After rolling, if you want to try to push for more successes, you can re-roll any dice that did not come up as a 6 or a 1. Actually, it gets a little tricky here. When you assemble your dice pool, you have to track the dice separately. Dice generated from your attributes are base dice. Skill points generate your skill dice, and then of course there's your fight die. When it comes to pushing a roll, you can only re-roll ones that came up on your base dice or your fight die, not on your skill dice. When pushing a roll, this will activate any ones that you happened to have rolled with your base dice and fight die. If one of these so-called banes is activated on a base die after a push, then you actually take damage to the core attribute that was rolled on. And if a bane is rolled with your fight die, this is considered a critical failure, for which there are different specific crit fail tables for you to roll depending on the action that you failed at. On the plus side, any bane that gets activated after a push gives you a point of fighting spirit, which is a point pool you'll use to activate special abilities and stunts. As far as turn economy, you get 1 fast action and 1 slow action per turn, or 2 fast actions. Here's a list of the slow actions in the game, and each of them is explained quite thoroughly. And these actions are kind of where the magic happens in the game. The choke rules, for example, are relatively involved and reflect reality to some degree. After a successful choke attempt, the defender has to roll their stamina skill each round after the first and take 1 damage to their might attribute if they fail that roll. Chokes don't directly do damage otherwise. Defenders can only escape by winning an opposed grapple roll, and only on their turn. And here's a list of fast actions, the most important of which is the defend action. You have to announce that you want to defend an attack before that attack is rolled, and it becomes an opposed roll. Each success that you roll on a defend roll cancels out an attacker's success. And if you end up rolling more successes than the attacker here, you can spend those extra successes on defense stunts. Stunts are a big part of the game because you'll be rolling extra successes all the time, and you'll want to be spending them on juicing up your attacks or your defenses. The way that stunts are presented in this game is a little different from most Year Zero engine games. Instead of stunts being associated with the 18 generic skills, they're associated with your chosen fighting style. So the Mantis fighting style has 8 different attack stunts that each have different costs, and 7 defense stunts, also with graduating costs. By the way, there are 6 distinct fighting styles presented in this game. Mantis boxing, which is an easier to play class that uses kicks, punches, hooking techniques to throw, trip, and take down. Monkey Boxer, which is a relatively complex class to play using ground fighting techniques. Eagle Claw Boxers are another one of the easier classes, and they use chokes, joint locks, and other grapple techniques. Cotton Boxers are of intermediate difficulty, and they're built for defensive techniques to whittle down their opponents. Elephant Boxers are another intermediate difficulty class, and they are grapple heavy as well. Oh, but they also sing magical songs that conjure the spirits of ancestors. I did mention there was magic in this game, right? And while we're on the subject of magic, there is the Elemental Boxer, who is a relatively difficult class to play in terms of complexity, and they wield 5 different elements through their fists. Your options via each of these elements is pretty involved, and I think it could be really rewarding once you have a firm grasp of the rules and the flow of the combat in the game. I wouldn't recommend starting your very first character as an elemental boxer though. Okay, here is one of the most important components of the game actually, the fighting techniques themselves. Anytime you choose your class and then get into a fight, you're mostly going to be using one of a handful of specific techniques that your chosen discipline affords you, and they are all drawn from this list of 89 techniques. They're broken down into strikes, that is with hand or fist, kicks, elbow strikes, knee strikes, throws, trips, and takedowns, standing submissions, chokes and locks, and ground submissions, chokes and locks. One thing I found interesting about this game is the fact that it doesn't shy away from weapon combat. The mechanics want to punish you for attempting to use a weapon that your character is not trained in, but there is no shortage of rules and guidance on how weapons actually work in combat. In the end, there's no punishment on a moral or ethical basis for your character to use weapons. It's not dishonorable or anything, unless I guess the GM imposes something like that in the setting. But as you might expect, weapons are not necessarily going to be more powerful than your bodily martial arts attacks. The damage ratings on all of them are completely on par with your kung fu attacks, and pushing your rolls will wear down your weapons eventually and require repairs, so there's that drawback. It could have been easy enough to just focus on hand-to-hand stuff, but the author really went all the way here. There are 14 pages total covering weapons. The game is also primarily composed of a GM guide. This is a 136-page book that is a bit of an odd duck in that it contains all of the core mechanics of the game. The first 50 pages or so reiterate the rules from the player's guide. Then the rest of the book has a bunch of practical advice and guidance on how to run the game. Then there is the Silt Road campaign, which is a 60-page book that presents a full campaign composed of 13 different missions organized into 3 acts. The end of this book is where you're actually going to finally get the enemy stat blocks. Stat blocks in this game are refreshingly brief. Enemies are generally just comprised of their 4 core stats and a handful of skill ratings under those stats. Boss level enemies will have extra stuff like armor, techniques, talents, and stunts. Alright, here are my thoughts so far on Fists and Fiends. Cons. I don't know what the techniques look like. Yeah, so I dabbled in several martial arts earlier in life, but honestly, I have no idea what many of these 89 listed techniques actually look like. This is a game that really wants GMs and players to be descriptive, and that's an important aspect of gameplay because the rules are relatively light, but without knowing what the techniques look like, folks would just be winging it here during combat. I brought up this point with the creator, and he informed me that he is actually working on an entire separate illustrated book that contains each of these techniques. He'll either make that happen as a stretch goal or in some other way. GM book redundancy. I thought it was a little strange that the GM book repeats all the rules of the game from the player's guide, and I asked the author about this as well. His rationale was that he wanted a resource for the GM that was all-inclusive and wouldn't require them to have to refer to 2 different books. I thought this made sense, but it is only a trick that you can pull off if your game is relatively light on the rules, which in this case it is. Pros. This feels like martial arts. The choking, the takedowns, the grappling, all of the combat in this game has a very authentic feel to it, even without me knowing the specific fighting techniques. The mechanical protocols for grappling is divided into standing, or ground grappling, which in and of itself speaks to the fact that the author has a deep native knowledge of the subject at hand. This is always nice in the RPG hobby when you come across a game designer who has domain knowledge. It seems like very few martial artists ever design a martial arts combat system for an RPG, and this is certainly the first time I've ever come across one, and the authenticity shows. Year Zero engine is familiar. Randy's choice to adopt his rules to Free League's Year Zero engine, more or less, goes a long way, at least for me, in making the game feel very approachable. I can't assume that you or most people out there have played a lot of Free League games, but I know I have, and I know they're popular. The D6 dice pool assembled across 4 core stats and 18 or so skills is just reflexive to me at this point, and that makes playing or running this game something that is within immediate reach. Styles are very differentiated. The 6 styles are largely very different from each other, and I appreciate that they are rated by their complexity so that new players don't step into an overly complicated first character. The more complex character classes also allow for some very interesting combat abilities. Stunts. I like how you can save up your extra successes and spend them on a fighting style specific stunt, and the fact that those stunts are all broken down into attacks and defensive moves. It's interesting that defense in this game is just as complex and nuanced as attack moves. Anti-murder mechanic. There is an overt morality imposed on characters in the game. You are allowed to kill opponents in the heat of the moment, such as in the middle of combat, but if you kill a character outside of those moments, your character will suffer a psychological toll. This is a nice mechanical measure to suppress murder hoboism. Whole campaign. I honestly don't think I'd know where to start with a 19th century Northern China Kung Fu adventure, so it's much appreciated that there is a 13 mission campaign included with the game. And in the GM book, there are about a dozen pages of guidance on how to run that campaign, which is not something I think I've seen before. So that's Fists and Fiends so far. The game is crowdfunding at the time of this recording. I'll leave links below. Let me know what you think of this game so far and if you plan on backing it. I'd also like to hear your thoughts on people designing RPGs around their personal domains of knowledge. Give me some good examples if you can think of any. And thanks as always for watching. I'll see you in the next one.